Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Smart Divorce podcast. We've got another special episode for you today, and we are going to be talking about what happens with financial settlements where either the spouse or one of the children has extra needs, has a disability or some other form of additional needs, meaning that spouse working is very difficult, and there are also ongoing responsibilities, caring responsibilities throughout the spouse's life. So I am joined to talk about this fascinating subject, which comes up all the time in the work that I do, by the wonderful Nicola Bright from Myerson. Hi Nicola, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you for that lovely introduction.
No problem. I'm going to ask you to tell us a bit about you and a bit about the work that you do in your career so far, if that's
Yeah,
okay to start with.
yeah, absolutely. So I am a family solicitor. So I specialise in family law, which covers a range of family issues, including divorce, disputes about children and where they will live on separation, or perhaps the amount of contact they will have with each parent. I also deal with issues surrounding surrogacy and fertility law, which falls under the family law umbrella. I assist people with pre-nuptial agreements and post-nuptial agreements. And I also help with more specialised things such as farming divorces, so divorces where there is a farm involved. It's quite vast, really, in terms of I pretty much do all family law. The only thing we don't cover in our department is if there's an unmarried couple who are in dispute about what to do with their property. It falls under civil law, and therefore we have a separate team at Myerson who deal with that. But everything else to do with the family, we will assist with. And really, it's about family breakdown is the main source of work in terms of divorcing people, getting them back to a hopefully stable financial position and assisting them with their finances is the majority of the work I do. And within that, obviously, there's lots of variations, disabled children and adults being one of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you've worked in family law for quite some time. I mean, people who can
Yes.
see you because they're watching on the YouTube channel will know you don't
Yes.
look like you're old enough to have been doing this for some time.
Oh,
But
thanks. Well, no, 15 years, I think this year, or 16 years this year. I've been working in family and I've been at Myerson for 11 years. So I've been here a long time, part of the furniture now, based in the centre of Altrincham. So I think because I've been here for a while, you get to know lots of people locally. And yeah, it's just a lovely place to work in Altrincham and at Myerson as well. So I'm very lucky.
Absolutely. No, it certainly is it certainly is a cracking firm, and your family team there are all fabulous.
Thank you.
Um, so we're going to talk today, and this situation comes up a lot in questions from clients, and actually seems to be coming up more and more.
Mm.
So if we start off with the situation with children, so
Mhm, mhm,
children who have disabilities, and these can be things such, when I say it's coming up more and more, I think because what I'm finding from clients is a lot of children with additional needs such
mhm,
as neurodiversities, autism,
mhm, mhm,
ADHD, um, some issues which in some cases, depending on where on the spectrum they are, they can happily hold down a full-time job or a
yeah,
part-time job.
yeah,
But in some cases, working for these children is not a possibility, and
mm,
even living independently in the future is not a
yeah,
possibility. So I think we're looking at a situation where certainly one of the spouses is
mhm,
going to have caring responsibilities for the rest of their lives,
mhm,
and is potentially going to need to put something in place for those dependent children
mhm,
for after they're not able to care for them themselves any longer.
mhm,
So difficult one. So
it is.
what are we looking at? So let's start with contact. So
Mhm,
how where the child might live,
Mhm.
and who looks after them and so on. So talk to me about that first.
And so most of the time when people separate, they can sit down and agree something between themselves, and it's a kitchen table discussion, and they both parents are in the right headspace to decide what's best for that child or the children. They may have a sibling group with the same um, difficulty. So autism does run in families, for example. So you may have 2 or 3 children with similar needs, or the same diagnosis but very differing needs. But
Yeah,
each family is so different. It's hard to really go into that in any other detail other than everyone
yeah,
knows that every family is unique. So if the parents can sit down and agree something that they know is right for that child, then that is going to be the absolute best way to deal with it. And we don't see those cases. They only come to us if they can't reach an agreement. So there are lots of families who manage this without solicitors and the courts becoming involved. If they come to us and say to me, I am really struggling, my ex doesn't seem to get it, doesn't understand that, you know, let's call this child Sarah, Sarah has these difficulties, and she simply doesn't like change and he doesn't understand it. He thinks she's going to adapt to a 50-50 arrangement. Those kind of conversations. This is quite a common problem we get, where one parent just doesn't seem to understand, perhaps because they've not been the primary caregiver, or don't want to really understand it because it means that they won't be seeing the child as much, sadly. That there may then be a dispute about where this child shall live or how much contact they should have with the other parent. So we would initially send them off to a mediator, where they could hopefully sit down with a mediator to try and reach an agreement, all looking at all the needs of the children in the particular case. Now, if that's not possible, some cases end up going to solicitors and then courts as a last resort. So when I'm talking now about what the court look at, I'm really talking about those cases that end up before a judge, so that your listeners know what the courts will look at when you're dealing with children with disabilities and special educational needs. So when they make any decision, when a court makes any decision about a child's care or the contact they have with the other parent or who they're going to live with, the welfare principle applies, which means that the court has to give paramount consideration. So that's above everything else, to the welfare of the child. So in this assessment, you're looking at the child as a unique being, as part of a sibling group potentially, and looking at their specific care needs, which are going to differ from case to case. Like you said, some children won't need much hand holding, but do have additional needs. Say they have some support at school, all the way down to physical disabilities where they are reliant on wheelchairs and care, or severe autism perhaps where they're non-verbal. So really differing extremes. So there's no uniform approach as to assessing what's in the best interests, or what's going to satisfy this paramount consideration test, but the judge has to consider the disabilities as part of that. So it can result in different decisions by the court for different sibling groups. So it may be that you have 2 siblings, one both on the autistic spectrum. One is at a more severe stage or presentation than the other, and it may be that that child has less contact or has a different contact arrangement than their sibling. So that can happen. I had a case where there was 3 children, all with quite severe autism and Asperger's, and 2 of them expressed verbally they wanted to see dad, and did see dad regularly, and then the youngest one just couldn't cope with any change, was non-verbal, so there was a different arrangement for him for now, which then changed in the future. So very, very different. So the court will look at, when they're looking at a live with argument, like who the child shall live with, the court are going to look at to what extent each parent is capable of meeting the children's needs, to decide whether what would be in the child's best interest. So courts have really wide-ranging powers as well, and they can even make decisions about whether a child receives a particular medical treatment or not, if there was a dispute about that. So it really is a balancing exercise. and it may well be that most of the time the court are going to need assistance from CAFCAS on this, who work for the court as an advisory service, who will go out and meet the parents and meet the children, so that the parents can be satisfied that everything's being looked at in a lot of detail, rather than a judge just sat there only with information before him or her and then making a decision. Actually, there's someone on the ground going to see the family, and they may see that family several times to decide what to advise the court, and they will then advise the court what's best for the children.
Wonderful, crikey.
Yeah,
Just,
it's a lot.
it is a lot, isn't it? So, just talk to me about CAFCAS just very briefly. What are they? Who are they? What does it mean? What do they do?
So CAFCAS work for the court system, for the justice system, and they are an organisation usually of ex-social workers. Actually, people in the social work field often go and work for CAFCAS, or they could be trained specifically by CAFCAS to do this work. So they will write to the parents on if someone makes an application to the court, the first thing they do is write to the parents and carry out what's called a safeguarding check. So they do things like police checks, social services checks, and have a really detailed discussion with each parent before the case even goes to court, to decide what the issues are and whether they can advise the court at an early stage whether actually this needs a lot of investigation, this needs more work. So when you've got a case where there are children with disabilities and special needs, the likelihood is at that very early stage, CAFCAS will say to the court, we need to do a full assessment here. We need to prepare a full report of recommendations, and it's going to take 3 to 4 months to complete, because they will meet the family several times and then prepare reports, and sometimes addendum reports and further reports. So they're involved with the family from start to finish. And they're a really great organisation, and the court wouldn't be able to function without them, because there's no one, like I say, on the ground actually advising the court what's in the best interest of these children.
Yeah, no, they sound ace. That sounds like a great plan.
Yeah.
And so then we move on to the financial situation, because where you've got families where the children don't have additional needs, essentially the recognition is that, although I know from personal experience this isn't actually the real case in real life, but children are classed as not children anymore and not needing maintenance, etc., from the end of their A-level year, so age 18.
Yes.
That, as I say, in reality, I'm sure most parents who have children over the age of 18 know that they're still going to be financially responsible.
After that age.
They certainly can do. But where you've got children with additional needs, with disabilities, with special educational needs, that continues and can well continue, as I said before, throughout their lifetime. So how do financial settlements differ for those families?
Yeah, so disability of a child and an adult child, so a child beyond the age of 18 who's still at home, either by virtue of disability or not. So that can influence what is fair and reasonable in two ways. So it can affect the adult themselves, and it can affect the child directly. So the legal position is, I mean, I say straightforward. It doesn't sound straightforward, but essentially the court's going to look at how that disability affects, in short, the primary caregiver, so the spouse who cares for the child most of the time, how it's going to affect their financial position. It's going to have we can assume it's going to have a negative impact on their financial position. So if we just scale back a bit and look at what the law provides for a disabled spouse, we can kind of work from there. So if you, within the legal framework that we use within this area of law, it's called the Matrimonial Causes Act that we look at. And there's a really important part of that act called Section 25, which has a list of factors that the court must consider when deciding how to divide finances and how to divide the assets of a marriage. So that health issues are not overlooked, the court have to as part of that process, have to look at one of the factors, which is any physical or mental disability of either of the parties of the marriage. So that covers your spouses. So the focus there is therefore on the disabled person's financial needs and their income and earning capacity, and looking at the financial impact of the health issues. And in cases where you've got a disabled adult divorcing, things like a contingency fund might be needed for care needs or ongoing ongoing periodical payments for ongoing medical needs. So they will have some benefits. Hopefully, the benefit system will provide some support, but the court will look at any unmet need where the gap needs bridging, and often that means that more money is needed from the other party if it allows. So there can be an unfair division of assets. What we say unfair, when I say unfair, I mean not 50-50, because that the other person simply wouldn't be able to survive without it and wouldn't be able to meet their own needs. And when you look at disabled children of those spouses or disabled adult children, there's nothing specific in legislation relating to a disabled child. But the actual Section 25 that I'm referred to has an overarching provision at the top which says the court's first consideration is given to any welfare of any minor child under 18. So that covers your children. But then what if the children are adult children that are disabled? And that's where things are a bit more blurry. But this is where it links back to the spouse's needs, because they are going to have caring responsibilities, and therefore their income and earning capacity is going to be very different from perhaps the other spouse because of these caring responsibilities. So that's really the starting point, is to look at the financial impact on that parent spouse who's looking after the adult disabled child. This could be a lifetime. They could be looking after them for their whole life, and then you need to look at, like you said before, what happens when they die? Where do the children? There needs to be provision for those children to be cared for when they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s. So all of those factors play a part, and they also look at things like adapted homes, specialised equipment, and all of that plays a part in the share of the assets of a case. So you are going to end up with most likely a case where more of the assets are going to be going one way than the other to really meet those needs. And to not do that would leave someone financially destitute. So every case is different, like I say, but I'd find it very difficult to see a case where someone will be left without enough money to keep their adapted home, for example, or pay for a disabled adult's child's medication, or their electricity bill could be huge because they're in the house all the time because perhaps they're immobile. So there's lots of factors, but it's huge expense to one party usually.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're looking at your needs as an individual, so once the children are grown up and assumed to be financially independent, your costs are going to be just for one adult, and your needs are just going to be for one adult. And it's feasible to see you moving down, downsizing to a small home, for example. Those options aren't available where there are caring needs, because you're actually still paying for, even simple things like you don't get the single adult discount on council tax because the two adults there. So all of those things, all of your costs, your food costs, your electricity costs, your gas costs, I mean, they're not going to double, but they are going to be higher if there are two adults.
Yeah, and they're going to stay the same, aren't they? This child's is going to stay there. They're going to stay. They're never going to drop. Like, you can have that option in other cases where the children go and leave the home, go off to uni. Potentially, the option to downsize and therefore reduce your bills. You just haven't got that option. You haven't got that freedom at all.
Yeah, no, definitely. That was something else I was going to ask you then, and it's gone. It'll no doubt come back.
Yeah, no problem.
when we're talking.
Yeah.
Do you tend to find that cases where these issues are kind of in the mix settle out of court, or do they often end up requiring a court to make a judgment on them?
It's difficult for me to answer that because I only see like the worst ones, which because they only really go to solicitors when they can't agree. I mean, if we get them as new cases, obviously we always try and settle them out of court. I'd probably say it's about 50-50 in terms of which ones settle at mediation and a bit of negotiation through the solicitor, and which ones have to go all the way to a court, and a decision by a judge, whether that's to do with child contact or whether that's to do with financial asset split. Yeah, I'd probably say it's about 50-50. It's really difficult when they go to court because it costs a lot of money. Legal aid isn't available in many cases. It's still available in some if there's been domestic abuse. So we always try and assess them for that as well to see if they qualify for legal aid, because often they're on a low income because they're on state benefits, because they've got carers allowance and they can't work. So it may well be that they do get legal aid if there's been domestic abuse or some form of abuse within the relationship. So it's really difficult if they do end up going to court. That's another financial factor to take into account, because they can say to the court, well, this is how much I've spent on legal fees, and then there has to be allowance for that as well, and whether they're divided between the two spouses or not. There's all sorts of things to take into account when you have to make an application to court. And some people rely on litigation funding to fund their legal fees, so they'll end up applying to a third-party lender who'll fund their legal fees that they then pay back at the end, which is like a liability, obviously a debt they'll have to pay. And I've seen cases where the other spouse has been ordered to pay those fees because there simply isn't the money available from the spouse with the disabled adult child or disabled child to pay it. So we try and keep them out of court because of all these extra considerations. Mainly there's a lack of income, lack of earning capacity. So it's really tough cases to deal with.
What about, I've remembered the question I was going to ask. What about respite? So if you've got a primary carer or primary caring parent who the child lives with, disabled adult child, let's be specific about it, he lives with them and they look after them kind of all the time, and there's little input from the other spouse. Do the court make provision or feel that it's reasonable to have as a need the respite care for the caring spouse?
Yeah, they would consider that as a very important need and a finance. So when you prepare your case for court, you have to list for the court a really detailed monthly outgoing schedule which covers all your financial needs. So respite care should be on that schedule, and it's then looked at as a whole. So say if your needs, let's just say for argument's sake, are £3,000 a month and you get benefits of say 1,000, there's a gap there of 2,000, and that respite care would be taken into account as part of that plugging the gap. And if the other person can afford to pay maintenance, and I'm assuming everyone's a high earner, they're not. These cases can be really difficult. You could have the other parent earning very little as well, and therefore you're looking at, can we downsize? Is it possible to downsize to release capital for these ongoing needs? But yes, it would be taken into account, absolutely, respite care, because it's really expensive. I know that there are some local authorities who do provide respite care and don't charge for it, but it's few and far between, and it's really hard to get that service. It's a postcode lottery.
Absolutely. So if there is the money in the family, respite care should be included in the ongoing needs, and it's not considered as like a big luxury. It's considered as something that's
a necessity,
a need. Okay.
Even holidays are taken into account as a need. It's not that they're considered as a luxury. Everyone's entitled to a holiday. Holidays with a disabled adult child, if it's possible, are going to cost more. So really have to, when you're doing these budgets, you really have to think very carefully and sit down with your client. So I'll sit down with them and go through everything in detail, and they won't think about this sort of stuff. And I'll say, how much does respite cost? How much will a holiday cost? What's the extra cost for taking the wheelchair on the plane? Or what's the extra cost of taking equipment? And they really need to think about it. And it's almost like, it could be like 3 pages long of just all these different outgoings. But across the year, you spread them out. Holidays you don't take every month. You spread the cost across the year, so you have an average. Sure. So that there's lots to do when you get divorced, sadly. So there is a lot of homework for someone who's going through it. It's really difficult sometimes to sit down and think of everything. So I'll often send them a big list to jog their memory about things they might forget to put down. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, when you're looking at disabled adult children, that
Mm,
there is even more, or or disabled spouses.
mm,
There could be, I don't know, like a scooter instead of a wheelchair, because
yeah,
so that they get some independence, maybe some changes that need to be adapted to the property to
yeah,
enable them to live there alone rather than if they were
yeah,
living with the spouse there. Those sorts of things have all got to be
yeah,
taken into consideration, don't they?
yeah, they really do.
So child maintenance is generally, as we talked about before, payable to from one spouse to another spouse
Mhm,
until the child is 18 or kind of ending
mhm,
required schooling.
mhm.
What's the situation for disabled adult children? Is there maintenance payable for them post
Yeah.
18?
Yeah, so if they're post 18, the court has the power to go beyond the typical government regime, which is the child maintenance service regime, which we all know and love, which ends when the child finishes A levels and doesn't cover anything like university or anything beyond that. So, but where there is a disabled child, the court do have jurisdiction to go beyond that CMS, that's child maintenance service regime. Um, and there's another provision under Schedule 1 of the Children Act, which is a different area of law that we can look to, where someone can apply for top-up maintenance, so lump sums, open-ended lump sums for things like adapted wheelchairs or adapted equipment needed in the home, or it can be anything, or it could be for an adapted car for a child that can drive but needs an adapted car, and also for housing provision for a disabled child. So if this is particularly helpful in a case where you've got unmarried parents, where there's no automatic right for one spouse to provide the other with a property or divide their capital, for example, the Schedule 1 of the Children Act where you have a disabled child, you can actually apply for housing provision for a disabled child. That
Wow.
house is always owned by the other person, but it's there for the provision of that child to live in with their carer. So it's quite far reaching what you can do.
Isn't it? Crikey, I didn't know
Yeah.
that. That's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah.
What what's the situation where um either the adult or the child is receiving or received
Mhm.
compensation for the
Mhm.
reason for their disability,
Mhm.
or charitable funding is available?
Mhm.
Or I guess the other one that I've seen a few times is where there's been and this isn't always a kind of resulting long term disability, but where there's been a payment for a critical illness, for example. So there's been some form of
Mhm.
lump sum payment been received either for the spouse or for the
For the
disabled
child.
adult child. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've seen this before as well with the critical illness. It's a funny one, isn't it? Because it's been paid out, but then they've survived whatever critical illness it was. Is that the kind of
Yeah.
situation you were thinking of?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's sort of in the pot, but should it
Yeah.
be in the pot or should it?
Yeah. Critical illness I'll talk about separately. I think it's a bit more, it's slightly different because it's probably not
That's
been,
fine.
won't have
It
been
just,
paid out for care needs. It will have been paid out because sadly that person may pass away. And they only pay out when it's really serious, don't they? The critical illness policy. So
yeah, they
something
do.
dramatic must have happened but it does happen. I've seen it before where the person, thankfully survives their illness. But if we look at compensation for now,
Sure.
if a person's received compensation because they've had an accident, say they've had a bad car accident,
Yeah.
and it's impacted on their daily life, or they've let's give an example of someone who's got really serious back injuries and therefore struggling to walk, has needed spinal surgery, that kind of thing, which sadly is really common when car
Yeah.
accidents happen. So they'll get compensation for that, and that money is therefore assumed to be earmarked for their care, and it should be, and usually is earmarked for their care in the context of a court looking at a case.
Yeah.
And because it's been so they've been through probably quite a legal battle to get that compensation, and it's been independently assessed already as that's what they need for their care. My husband's a personal injury barrister, and I've seen the schedules he has to do, and he, is very, very meticulous in terms of what is needed for their care for the rest of their life. So to tap into that money would be wrong, really, morally. And I think the court recognised that. So when you have got compensation, there's usually a very, very strong argument that that's ring fenced and not touched as part of the split. It can be taken into account in the sense, well, you've got that money and that money covers you for an adapted property, which can help the other side because they don't need to put their hand in their pocket and buy them a property, or not necessarily buy them one, but the assets don't need to shift too much. But I would say there's no argument for a spouse who's not received the compensation to say, well, I want 50% of that. That wouldn't happen. The court will look at it as meeting their needs, and therefore it should be earmarked for that. Same goes if you have like a military charity providing funding to make life easier for a disabled service person. There's a strong argument that that charity funding should be ring-fenced and protected on divorce. It can be taken into account as a resource, so it helps in the sense of, well, that person doesn't have the need for maintenance as much, perhaps, that they would if that money wasn't there. But it'd be very difficult to tap into that money and to be able to share that in a divorce.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And then with the critical illness policy, if the person's fully recovered and they've had their critical illness payment paid out and they've fully recovered and it's therefore not needed, then there's more of an argument for that to be shared or taken into account as part of the overall settlement. Definitely. It's quite different from compensation in the sense that person's disabled for life. They're going to need that money. If someone's, made a miraculous recovery and has got this critical illness payout, but they're not going to need that money for care, there's more of an argument from the other side's point of view to say that should be at least not shared 50-50, I wouldn't say, but shared in that it will taken into account as part of the settlement.
Okay, no, fair enough. It's a difficult one, that, isn't it? Because you kind of feel, well, if somebody's been through a critical illness and survived, you kind of feel like it.
I know.
It feels like it ought to be.
It's a lot of timing as well, if they were paid out after separation, there's more of an argument for it to be kept back. If it's been paid out during the marriage, they were still in a relationship, they kind of utilized it a bit and shared in it and intermingled it with marital funds, there's much more of an argument for it to be shared as part of the asset split. So it really depends when it was received, whether it is at all needed for care at all, if someone's left with any lasting illness from the illness they got over. It's a difficult one, but I'd say it's less clear cut than the compensation, definitely, because you just don't know if that person's going to have those long-term needs if they've recovered.
Fair enough. No, that makes sense.
If
I'm just thinking of the disabled adult children's situation again, and so quite often they will receive some payments from the government to support them. So I'm thinking of PIP, for example, that they might receive through their lifetime. Does that need to go into the pot as an income, and that's kind of received, and therefore would you take all of the child's ongoing needs into consideration? Because I know there are some cases where I work with families and the PIP is classed as belonging to the adult child, and used to pay for discretionary spending for them, and then the kind of ongoing kind of housing needs, bills, etc., food, etc., and to an extent holidays, because PIP's not that much, are kind of all in the pot paid for by the parents. How or does it depend on how much money there is in the pot in the first place and how much is available?
So if you had like a particularly wealthy family and there wasn't a need to look at the PIP as a resource, you probably would, and it was belonging to the child, sat in a bank account, perhaps being used for ad hoc spending, you probably wouldn't need to look at it. And it would depend on this. So if you've got a severely disabled child who isn't able to control their own bank account, for example, and that PIP is, although it goes into a bank account, there's a power of attorney for the parent to access it, and that PIP is very much used for day-to-day care and it is used, it's all used up, it's used every month, then what the other side would argue is to say, well, that's an income resource available to you and that's already paying for some of the expenses you've listed. And they've got an argument, that's valid. So therefore the court would want some disclosure about how much money is being used from the PIP towards the expenditure. But in a case where you've got, two wealthy parents, for example, and that PIP is perhaps being used, is being built up in an account, or is perhaps being used by the adult disabled child to, pay for things online or go out with their friends every now and again, then there's less of an argument for that to be taken into account, because really it's not being accessed by that parent.
Yeah.
But the other side are going to jump up and down about that and say, well, it's for the care needs, and therefore it needs knocking off this income schedule, this budget you've put down to the court that you've written down. So it depends which side of the coin you're on, really. But I think the court would be interested to know who's getting it, who's using it, and is it all being used, to decide really if it's. But I think 9 times out of 10, it's going to be being used for care needs and care, and therefore the other side have got a valid argument to say that's going to have to come off your budget, because you can't say to me you need £2,000 a month when actually you're already getting 600 to pay for some of this stuff. I mean, I don't know what the exact figures are. I know that the higher rate PIP is obviously more if you've got the mobility element, but they're not massive amounts of money. Every 4 weeks, they're not. I wouldn't even say it was over £1,000. So it's going to play a part. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. You'll be amazed to hear we're coming to the end of our time together.
I know it goes so quick.
It flown. It does.
Yeah,
it really
no
does. Before we go, is there anything that you want to add, or anything that you feel that I should have asked you about that we haven't talked about?
I think we've covered most issues, really. It is the problem with family law is that there is such a wide discretion when you have a court involved that it's really difficult for us to advise in any certainty exactly what might happen. We can say what the range of outcomes might be, but with cases being so different and differing needs of each child, or perhaps you've got a disabled spouse and their needs, or we can present the case as best we can, and then ultimately if you end up in court, it's up to a judge. But these are sort of general pointers in terms of the court they're not going to ignore disability, they're not going to ignore needs, they're not going to ignore care needs, and they're certainly not going to ignore the needs of a disabled adult child. So I hope that listeners can take comfort in that if they are thinking about separating and have these issues in their family. But obviously, if they ever want to speak to anyone about it, we do a free consultation. We can speak to someone on the phone for half an hour and give them some pointers before they even make a decision as to what to do. Because some people just really feel a bit trapped in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Nicola's details will be in the show notes. So if you need to reach out to her because this is you, or if you're in a situation where you're trying to negotiate a settlement and this is your family and you're struggling to get anywhere, please do reach out to Nicola, because I'm sure she'd be delighted to hear from you.
Yes, thank you.
It just remains for me to thank you for joining us today. I think that was massively useful. I know lots of people who will really benefit from listening to this episode. Thank you for listening today. And if you have felt that this was useful, please do give us a 5-star rating, because that helps us get the podcast out to more and more people who need us. Okay, many thanks.
Thank you.